At exactly 8:17 a.m., my son looked me in the eyes and smiled. "Dad, this is only a routine medical checkup. We will be back home before lunch." I believed him because he was my son. I had trusted him since the day I first held him as a baby. I had no idea that before the sun set, I would lose my freedom, my home, and almost everything I had spent 40 years building. If only I had noticed the small envelope hidden inside my late wife's favorite Bible that morning, everything might have happened differently. My name is William Hayes. I am 71 years old, and for more than 4 decades, I built Hayes Industrial from a tiny warehouse into one of the most respected manufacturing companies in the state. Every machine, every contract, and every employee carried a piece of my life's work. When my wife, Eleanor, passed away after a long battle with cancer, the silence inside our home became unbearable. My son Daniel insisted he wanted to help. He handled my appointments, organized my paperwork, and visited almost every day. Friends told me I was lucky to have such a caring son. I believed every word. Over the following months, Daniel kept mentioning my age. He reminded me whenever I misplaced my glasses or forgot where I had left my keys. He laughed kindly and said, "Dad, everyone slows down eventually." At first, I thought he was simply worried about me. Then he started taking over more decisions without asking. He changed my doctor, managed my finances, and even convinced me to stop visiting the company because he claimed the stress was bad for my health. I ignored the uneasy feeling growing inside me because I wanted to believe he was acting out of love. That Tuesday morning, Daniel helped me into his car. He smiled the entire drive, making casual conversation about the weather and asking what I wanted for dinner later. When we arrived, I noticed the building did not look like any hospital I had ever visited. The words Maple Grove Senior Living were written across the entrance. I looked at Daniel in confusion. He squeezed my shoulder and quietly said, "Dad, this is your new home." My heart stopped. I stared at the sign for several seconds, convinced there had been some terrible mistake. "Daniel," I said quietly, "you told me we were going to the doctor." He avoided my eyes. "Dad, the doctor agrees this is the safest place for you now." Before I could respond, 2 staff members walked outside carrying a wheelchair. "That will not be necessary," I said firmly. "I can still walk." They smiled politely, but Daniel whispered, "Please do not make this harder." Those words hurt more than anything else. They were not asking me to visit. They were asking me to surrender. Inside the lobby, a cheerful receptionist greeted me by name and handed Daniel a stack of admission papers. I watched as he signed every page without once asking my opinion. Then she handed him a small envelope containing my room key, medication schedule, and visitor policy. Visitor policy? My stomach tightened. This had been planned long before I arrived. While Daniel finished the paperwork, I quietly looked around. Some residents stared silently through the windows. Others sat alone, with family photographs resting on their laps. I suddenly realized I was looking at my possible future. A nurse gently guided me toward a small room with a single bed, 1 chair, and a narrow window overlooking the parking lot. "You can decorate it however you like," she said kindly. I smiled politely, but it did not feel like a room. It felt like a prison disguised with warm paint. A few minutes later, Daniel placed my suitcase beside the bed. "Dad, give it some time. You will make new friends here." I looked at him and asked the only question that mattered. "How long am I staying?" He hesitated before answering. "For now, permanently." My chest tightened. 40 years of building a business, raising a family, and creating a home had somehow ended in a room where I owned nothing except a suitcase. After Daniel left, I walked to the window and watched his car disappear through the front gate without looking back even once. The silence felt unbearable until an elderly man in the next room slowly knocked on my open door. He smiled sadly and said, "First day?" I nodded. He replied, "Mine started exactly the same way. My children said it was temporary too." Before I could answer, he leaned closer and quietly whispered something that made my blood run cold. "If your family suddenly became very interested in your money, you need to check who is running your business today." The old man introduced himself as Harold Mitchell, an 80-year-old, retired accountant who had been living at Maple Grove for nearly 2 years. His tired smile told me he had seen too many stories like mine. "Families do not always leave people here because they cannot care for them," he said quietly. "Sometimes they leave them here because they want something." His words stayed with me long after he returned to his room. That evening, I could not stop thinking about my company. Hayes Industrial had been my life's work. Yet during the past 6 months, Daniel had slowly convinced me to stay away. Every time I suggested visiting the office, he claimed everything was running perfectly. I had trusted him without question. The next morning, I asked the receptionist if I could make a phone call. She smiled kindly and handed me the phone. I dialed the company's main number from memory. After 2 rings, the receptionist answered, but before I could introduce myself, she politely said, "Hayes Industrial. Please hold while I transfer you to our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Daniel Hayes." Hearing my son's title felt strange. When Daniel answered, his voice immediately became tense. "Dad, why are you calling the office?" "You should be resting," I replied calmly. "I only wanted to ask how business is going." He laughed softly. "Everything is under control. You do not need to worry about the company anymore." Before I could ask another question, he ended the call. Something did not feel right. Daniel had never spoken to me like that before. Later that afternoon, Harold knocked on my door again. He placed an old newspaper on my bed and pointed to a business article. Across the front page was a photograph of Daniel standing outside Hayes Industrial beside several unfamiliar investors. The headline read, "Hayes Industrial preparing for historic sale." My hands began shaking. Sale? I had never approved selling the company. Beneath the article, another sentence nearly stopped my heart. CEO Daniel Hayes expected to finalize negotiations within days. I stared at the page in disbelief. There was only one problem. Daniel could negotiate all he wanted because he did not own the company. Only 3 people had ever known the truth: my late wife Eleanor, our family attorney, and me. Years earlier, Eleanor had convinced me to keep 51% of the company's voting shares in my own name. Daniel had become CEO, but he could never legally sell Hayes Industrial without my written approval. I suddenly realized why he had wanted me hidden away. He believed I was powerless. Just as I folded the newspaper, a nurse entered my room carrying a visitor form. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a smile, "there is a gentleman here to see you. He says he has represented your family for more than 30 years, and he insists it cannot wait." When I walked into the visitor's room, my heart nearly stopped. Sitting quietly by the window was Arthur Bennett, the attorney who had represented my family for more than 3 decades. He stood the moment he saw me and shook my hand tightly. "William," he said softly, "I have been trying to reach you for 3 days. Daniel told everyone you were too ill to receive visitors." My stomach tightened. I had never been sick. Arthur placed a thick leather folder on the table and slid it toward me. "Before we discuss anything else," he said, "I need you to answer one question. Did you authorize the sale of Hayes Industrial?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Of course not." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, as though he had expected that answer. Then he slowly opened the folder. Inside were copies of contracts, board meeting minutes, and a draft agreement showing Daniel was negotiating to sell the company for nearly $180 million. My hands trembled as I turned each page. There was only one thing missing: my signature. Arthur pointed to a section marked "Majority Shareholder Approval Required." The space beneath it was completely blank. "Without you," he explained, "this company cannot legally be sold." I felt a wave of relief until he placed another document in front of me. It was a medical evaluation stating that I was mentally incapable of managing my financial affairs. I looked at Arthur in shock. "Who signed this?" He answered quietly, "A doctor I have never worked with before." I immediately realized what Daniel had done. If he could convince the court that I was mentally unfit, someone else could be appointed to make decisions on my behalf, including approving the sale. Arthur leaned forward and lowered his voice. "William, there is one reason I came today. Years ago, Eleanor made me promise something." Hearing my wife's name instantly caught my attention. He reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope with Eleanor's handwriting across the front. "For William. If anyone ever tries to take the company from him." My hands shook as I held the envelope. Eleanor had always noticed danger long before I did. Arthur smiled sadly. "She told me this day might come. She only hoped she would be wrong." Before I could open the envelope, Arthur's phone rang. He listened for a few seconds, then looked at me with an expression I will never forget. "William, Daniel just scheduled the final sale meeting." He paused before adding the words that changed everything. "It is tomorrow morning." I stared at the sealed envelope in my hands, unable to believe Eleanor had prepared for a betrayal she hoped would never happen. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small silver key taped to the corner. "William," Eleanor had written, "if you are reading this, someone is trying to take away everything you built. Do not panic. The truth is already protected." My heartbeat quickened. She explained that years earlier she had convinced me to store the original share certificates, the company bylaws, and several confidential legal documents in a private bank safety deposit box. Only Arthur and I knew where it was. If anyone ever questioned my ownership, those papers would prove beyond doubt that I remained the majority shareholder. Arthur smiled for the first time since arriving. Daniel has copies, he said, but we have the originals. He then showed me another document that made my stomach turn. Daniel had already invited investors, board members, and the media to tomorrow's meeting. He wanted the sale to become public immediately after the contracts were signed. He believes you are too weak to stop him, Arthur said quietly. He has no idea you still control the company. That evening, after Arthur left, I sat alone in my room at Maple Grove thinking about the son I had raised. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle, taking him fishing, and bringing him to the factory when he was only 10 years old. Every memory made the betrayal hurt even more. Just before lights out, Harold knocked gently on my door. "Bad news?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled sadly and replied, "Then tomorrow must become your good day." Early the next morning, Arthur returned exactly at 7 o'clock. We drove straight to the bank, where the manager unlocked the safety deposit box. Inside were the original share certificates, Eleanor's signed legal instructions, and one more sealed envelope labeled, "Play only if Daniel ever chooses greed over family." Arthur looked at me with surprise. I never knew she left a second message. Slipped the envelope into my jacket without opening it. Whatever Eleanor had prepared, she wanted it revealed at the perfect moment. As we pulled into the company's headquarters, I saw dozens of expensive cars filling the parking lot. Investors, directors, and reporters were already walking inside. Through the glass entrance, I spotted Daniel standing proudly at the podium, smiling as cameras flashed around him. He believed today would make him the richest man in the room. He never imagined his father was about to walk through those same doors. As Arthur and I stepped into the lobby, every conversation around us suddenly stopped. Employees stared at me as though they had seen a ghost. Several of them quickly stood up, smiling with relief. "Mr. Hayes, we thought you were seriously ill," one longtime employee whispered. Before I could answer, Daniel noticed me from across the conference room. The confident smile on his face disappeared instantly. For a brief second, he looked genuinely frightened. Then he forced himself to smile and walk toward me. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound calm. "You should be resting." I looked him in the eyes and replied, "I came to attend the meeting about my company." The room fell completely silent. Daniel laughed nervously. "Everyone knows I am the CEO," I nodded. "Yes, you are the CEO." Then I calmly added, "But being CEO does not make you the owner." Murmurs spread across the room. The investors exchanged confused looks while several board members quietly opened the meeting folders in front of them. Arthur stepped forward and placed the original share certificates on the conference table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "William Hayes still legally owns 51% of Hayes Industrial. No se can proceed without his written approval." One investor immediately stood up. "Mr. Hayes," he asked Daniel, "you told us your father had already transferred full ownership." Daniel's face turned pale. "There must be some misunderstanding," he stammered. Arthur calmly opened another folder. Inside was a copy of the proposed sale agreement. He pointed directly to the signature page. The line reserved for the majority shareholder remained completely blank. "This transaction," Arthur said firmly, "has never been legally authorized." Cameras that had arrived to celebrate the sale immediately turned toward me instead. Reporters began taking photographs as whispers filled the room. Daniel tried one final time to regain control. "Dad is confused," he said loudly. "His doctors confirmed he is no longer capable of making business decisions." Before anyone could respond, Arthur handed the board members an independent medical evaluation completed that very morning by one of the state's leading specialists. It clearly stated that I was mentally healthy and fully competent to manage my affairs. The false report Daniel had relied upon collapsed in seconds. The chairman of the board slowly stood up and looked directly at my son. "Daniel," he said, "before this meeting continues, there is one question you need to answer." He paused, letting the silence fill the room. "Why did you tell every investor that your father was incapable when he was not?" Daniel stood frozen as every eye in the boardroom turned toward him. For the first time in his career, He had no prepared speech, no confident smile, and no easy explanation. He glanced at the investors, then at the board members, hoping someone would rescue him. No one spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I only did what I believed was best for the company." His words echoed through the room, but they convinced no one. The chairman looked disappointed. "This meeting is no longer about the sale," he said firmly. "It is now about your conduct as chief executive officer." Arthur quietly handed each board member a sealed packet that Eleanor had instructed him to keep for emergencies. Inside were years of company records, board resolutions, and one handwritten statement from Eleanor herself. She explained that William had deliberately remained the majority shareholder, not because he distrusted his son, but because every family business needed one final safeguard against greed, outside pressure, or reckless decisions. Her words filled the room with silence. One board member stood and asked Daniel a direct question. "Did you knowingly tell investors that you already controlled the company?" Daniel hesitated for several seconds before whispering, "Yes." Another director immediately followed. "Did you tell employees that your father had permanently stepped away from the business?" Again, Daniel quietly answered, "Yes." The room grew heavier with every admission. Then Arthur reached into his briefcase and removed the final sealed envelope Eleanor had left behind. Across the front she had written, "Open only if Daniel chooses power over family." I slowly opened it. Inside was a flash drive and a short handwritten note. Arthur connected the flash drive to the conference room screen. Eleanor appeared on the monitor, smiling gently despite the illness that had weakened her body. "If you are watching this," she began, "then I was right to prepare for the day I prayed would never come." She looked directly into the camera. "Daniel, your father spent his entire life building this company so one day you could lead it with honor. If you are seeing this message, then somewhere along the way, you forgot that leadership is earned through character, not inherited through blood." No one moved. Even Daniel lowered his head. Then Eleanor spoke the words that shocked the entire room. "Arthur, if William is present, please hand him the final resolution I signed before my death. It is time for the board to know the truth about who will decide the future of Hayes Industrial." Arthur slowly smiled, reached into another folder, and placed one final legal document on the chairman's desk. The chairman read the first paragraph, then looked up at me in complete disbelief. The chairman read the document twice before slowly removing his glasses. The room was so quiet that no one dared breathe. Finally, he looked at me and asked, "William, is this real?" Arthur answered before I could speak. "Every signature has already been verified. Every page was notarized years ago." The chairman nodded and turned the document so the board could see it. Eleanor's final resolution stated that if any CEO of Hayes Industrial ever attempted to deceive the board, manipulate ownership, or remove William through dishonesty, the board had the authority to immediately suspend that CEO and appoint a temporary replacement until a full investigation was completed. Daniel's face turned completely white. "This cannot be happening," he whispered. The chairman stood and addressed the room. "According to this resolution, and based on the evidence presented today, Daniel Hayes is suspended as chief executive officer effective immediately." The words echoed through the conference room like thunder. Several security officers who had been standing near the entrance quietly stepped forward. Daniel looked directly at me. "Dad, please tell them this is a mistake." My heart broke hearing his voice, but I remembered every lie that had brought us to this moment. "Daniel," I replied calmly, "this is not happening because you made one mistake. This is happening because you built one lie after another." The investors immediately withdrew the proposed purchase agreement. One after another, they closed their folders and stood up. "Our company does not do business where trust has already been broken," the lead investor said before leaving the room. Within minutes, the $180 million deal had completely collapsed. As reporters rushed outside to file breaking news stories, several longtime employees walked over to shake my hand. Many of them had worked beside me for more than 30 years. One elderly supervisor quietly said, "Mr. Hayes, we never stopped believing this company was yours." Before I could answer, Arthur leaned toward me and whispered, "William, there is still one document nobody has seen." I looked at him in surprise. He pulled a small envelope from inside Eleanor's file. Across the front, in her familiar handwriting, were the words, "Read this only after Daniel loses everything." My hands began trembling once again. Eleanor had somehow known this exact moment would come, and whatever she had written next would decide whether my son still had a future. The envelope felt heavier than paper alone. I slowly unfolded Eleanor's final letter, while Daniel stood only a few feet away. His shoulders slumped, and his confidence shattered. Every person in the boardroom watched in complete silence. Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled the page. William, if Daniel has reached this point, then he has already punished himself more than anyone else ever could. Greed always collects its price. The question is no longer whether he deserves justice. The question is whether he deserves another chance. I stopped, reading for a moment, struggling to hold back my emotions. The room remained silent. Then I continued. Do not protect him from the consequences of his actions. Let him face them honestly. But if one day he truly accepts responsibility without excuses, remember that he is still your son. Daniel lowered his head, unable to look at anyone. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I saw genuine regret instead of pride. The chairman quietly cleared his throat and announced that the board had reached a unanimous decision. Daniel would be removed permanently as chief executive officer pending a full investigation into his actions. His executive privileges were revoked immediately, and an independent audit of every financial decision made during his leadership would begin that afternoon. Daniel did not argue. He simply nodded, knowing there was nothing left to defend. As security escorted him toward the exit, he suddenly turned back to face me. Tears filled his eyes. Dad, I thought if I controlled the company, people would finally respect me. I never realized I was losing the only person whose respect truly mattered. His words hit me harder than any legal document ever could. Before I could answer, Arthur leaned toward me and whispered, William, the audit team has already found something unusual. I looked at him in surprise. He handed me a confidential report showing that Daniel had not acted alone. Several outside investors and one senior executive inside Hayes Industrial had secretly encouraged him to remove me because they believed I was the only obstacle, preventing them from taking control of the company. Suddenly, I realized this had never been just a family betrayal. Someone else had been quietly pulling the strings from the very beginning. The moment Arthur handed me the audit report, I realized my son's betrayal was only part of a much larger plan. The report identified one name again and again: Victor Langford, Hayes Industrial's chief financial officer. Victor had worked beside me for nearly 20 years. I had trusted him almost as much as I trusted my own family. According to the investigators, Victor had secretly introduced Daniel to the investment group months earlier. He convinced my son that selling the company would make him wealthy overnight and that I was too old to understand modern business. Even worse, emails revealed Victor had personally arranged meetings with the doctor who falsely declared me mentally unfit. My hands shook as I read each page. This had never been a simple mistake fueled by greed. It had been a carefully planned conspiracy. The board immediately voted to suspend Victor and ordered company security to prevent him from leaving the building. Minutes later, security officers escorted him into the conference room. He still carried the same confident smile he always wore during board meetings. There has to be some misunderstanding, he said calmly. Arthur placed printed copies of Victor's emails, bank transfers, and private messages on the table. The smile disappeared from his face almost instantly. One director asked quietly, "Did you convince Daniel to remove William Hayes?" Victor remained silent. Another director slid forward records showing large payments from the investor group into an account connected to one of Victor's consulting companies. The evidence was overwhelming. Finally, Victor leaned back in his chair and laughed bitterly. "Your son was easy to manipulate," he admitted. He wanted power. I simply showed him how to get it. Daniel, who had been waiting outside with security, overheard every word. His face turned pale as he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. He slowly looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Dad, I thought all of this was my idea." Before I could answer, two police detectives entered the boardroom carrying arrest warrants. One of them looked directly at Victor and said, "Mr. Langford, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and financial misconduct." As they placed him in handcuffs, Victor turned toward me with a cold smile and whispered one final sentence that sent a chill through the entire room. "You may have saved your company today, William, but there is one secret your wife took to her grave that even you never discovered." Victor's final words echoed through the silent boardroom, long after the detectives led him away. For a moment I stood frozen, wondering whether he was simply trying to hurt me one last time or whether Eleanor had truly kept another secret from me. Arthur gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "William," he said quietly, "do not let a desperate man control your thoughts." I wanted to believe him, but I had learned one painful lesson over the past few days. sometimes the people closest to you, hide the biggest truths. That evening, after the board officially appointed an interim CEO, I returned home for the first time since Daniel had placed me in the nursing home. Walking through my front door brought back memories of Eleanor in every room. Her favorite chair still faced the fireplace, and the scent of her lavender perfume seemed to linger in the hallway. I sat alone in our bedroom until my eyes fell on an old wooden jewelry box she had treasured for years. I had never opened it after her death because it felt too personal. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside were family photographs, handwritten anniversary cards, and a small velvet pouch containing our wedding rings. Beneath them rested a folded envelope with my name written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. My heart began racing. I carefully opened it and unfolded the letter. William, if you have found this letter, then everything has already happened exactly as I feared. Do not waste your heart on wondering whether I kept secrets from you. I never hid the truth because I doubted you. I hid it because I wanted to protect you until the right moment. Tears filled my eyes as I continued reading. Eleanor explained that years earlier she had quietly created a charitable foundation using part of our personal wealth. The foundation would provide scholarships for children of Hayes, industrial employees, and financial support for families facing medical crises. She had deliberately kept it private because she wanted the gift to unite the family after her death, not become a source of pride or publicity. At the bottom of the letter was one final request. Promise me that no matter what Daniel has done, you will never let hatred become the final inheritance our family leaves behind. I folded the letter and closed my eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt peace replacing anger. Just then, my phone rang. It was the county jail. The officer on the line spoke calmly. Mr. Hayes, your son has refused every visitor except one. He says he will only speak to you. The phone remained in my hand long after the officer finished speaking. Part of me wanted to refuse. Daniel had lied to me, abandoned me in a nursing home, and nearly destroyed everything I had spent my life building. But Eleanor's final words echoed through my heart. Do not let hatred become the final inheritance our family leaves behind. The following morning, I drove to the county jail. Daniel looked nothing like the confident executive who had once stood before investors. His expensive suit had been replaced by a plain jail uniform, and the pride in his eyes had disappeared. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, Dad, I do not expect your forgiveness. I only need you to know the truth. I listened quietly. Daniel admitted that Victor Langford had spent months convincing him that I no longer trusted him and planned to leave the company to charity instead of family. Victor repeatedly told him that if he did not act first, he would lose everything. At first, Daniel refused. But after my wife's death, his fear and insecurity slowly turned into greed. Every lie became easier than the last, he said, tears filling his eyes. By the time I realized Victor was using me, I had already betrayed the only person who truly loved me. For the first time, I believed every word he said. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Daniel, I said quietly, you did not lose my company because Victor deceived you. You lost it the moment you stopped telling the truth. He lowered his head and began to cry. Before leaving, I handed him Eleanor's letter. Your mother wanted you to read this one day, I said. Not because you earned it, but because she never stopped believing you could become a better man. Daniel held the letter against his chest, without saying a word. As I walked toward the exit, the jail officer hurried after me. Mr. Hayes, he said, there is one more thing you should know. I turned around. The officer handed me a legal envelope that had arrived only an hour earlier. It had been sent by the lead detective investigating Victor Langford. Across the front, in bold letters, were the words, recovered evidence, open immediately. I opened the detective's envelope before I even reached my car. Inside was a flash drive, several financial records, and a handwritten note. Mr. Hayes, during our investigation, we discovered evidence that was never used in court because it does not relate to the criminal charges. However, we believe you deserve to know the truth. My hands trembled as I read further. The documents revealed that Victor Langford had not only planned to steal Hayes Industrial, he had also secretly borrowed millions of dollars using fake consulting agreements. If the company had been sold, the hidden debt would have transferred to the new owners, leaving Hayes Industrial on the edge of financial collapse. Daniel had believed he was selling a successful company for a fortune. In reality, Victor intended to disappear with the money while my son took the blame for everything. Arthur reviewed the records later that afternoon and looked at me with relief. William, he said, If you had not walked into that boardroom when you did, Hayes Industrial would probably have gone bankrupt within a year. I slowly sat back in my chair, realizing how close I had come to losing not only my company but the jobs of hundreds of loyal employees who depended on it. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with every employee. Standing on the factory floor where I had spent most of my life, I told them the complete truth. I apologized for allowing dishonesty to grow inside my own family and promised that Hayes Industrial would move forward with integrity, transparency, and respect. When I finished speaking, the room remained silent for a moment before the employees stood and applauded. Many of them had tears in their eyes because they knew the company and their livelihoods had been saved. As everyone began leaving, an elderly maintenance worker who had worked beside me since the company's earliest days walked over and smiled. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "your wife used to tell us that character is revealed when everything else is taken away." She was right. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Just as I prepared to leave the factory, Arthur received a phone call from the district attorney's office. He listened quietly, then turned toward me with an expression I had never seen before. "William," he said softly, "Victor Langford has agreed to testify, and what he is about to reveal could change Daniel's future forever." Victor Langford's decision to testify surprised everyone involved in the case. According to the district attorney, he had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for revealing the full truth behind the conspiracy. A week later, I sat quietly inside the courtroom as Victor took the witness stand. He looked older than I remembered, as though the weight of his own choices had finally caught up with him. After taking the oath, he admitted that the plan to remove me from Hayes Industrial had been his idea from the very beginning. He confessed that Daniel had never approached him about stealing the company. Instead, Victor had spent months feeding my son lies, convincing him that I no longer trusted him, that I planned to cut him out of the business, and that selling the company was the only way to secure his future. Then Victor revealed something that shocked the entire courtroom. He admitted he had secretly forged internal financial reports and manipulated company records to make Daniel believe the business was already failing. Every major decision my son made had been based on false information created by Victor himself. The prosecutor then asked the question everyone wanted answered. Did Daniel Hayes know he was participating in fraud? Victor lowered his head before answering quietly, "No. He believed he was protecting what he thought would soon belong to him." The fraud was mine. The courtroom fell silent. Daniel still had to answer for his lies, for placing me in a nursing home, and for trying to remove me from my own company. But the most serious criminal accusations against him suddenly collapsed. The judge looked directly at Daniel and said, "Your greed brought you here, but it was another man's deception that pushed you across the line." Several weeks later, Daniel accepted responsibility for every non-criminal action he had taken and publicly apologized to me, our employees, and the board of directors. He resigned from every leadership position and promised never to seek control of Hayes Industrial again, unless he earned that trust honestly. As the hearing ended, I thought the nightmare was finally over. But outside the courthouse, a young woman approached me carrying a worn leather folder. She introduced herself as Victor Langford's daughter. With tears in her eyes, she handed me the folder and quietly said, "Before my father was taken away, he begged me to give this to you. He said only you would understand why he became the man he did." I accepted the worn leather folder without knowing what to expect. Inside were old photographs, medical bills, and dozens of handwritten journal pages. As I read them, I discovered a side of Victor Langford I had never known. Years earlier, his wife had died after a long illness, leaving him alone to raise his young daughter. Desperate to keep up with mounting debt, he made one dishonest financial decision, then another, until lies became easier than the truth. None of it excused what he had done to my family. But for the first time, I understood that greed had not been born overnight. It had grown from fear, pride, and years of refusing to ask for help. Victor's final letter ended with a sentence I will never forget. "Please tell my daughter that her father was not born a criminal. He simply kept making one bad choice after another, until there was no honest road left." I quietly closed the folder and handed it back to his daughter. "Your father must face the consequences of his actions," I said gently, "but you do not have to carry his mistakes for the rest of your life." Tears filled her eyes as she thanked me. A few days later, I visited Hayes Industrial once again. The company was slowly returning to normal, but I knew something had to change. Standing before the board, I announced that no member of my family, including me, would automatically inherit leadership of the business again. From that day forward, every future CEO would be chosen by merit, integrity, and the trust of the board rather than by blood alone. Some directors looked surprised, but every one of them voted in favor of the decision. After the meeting, I walked through the factory, greeting employees whose families had depended on Hayes Industrial for generations. Watching them work reminded me why I had built the company in the first place. It had never been about money. It had always been about people. That evening, I drove to the cemetery carrying fresh white lilies. I knelt beside Eleanor's grave, placed the flowers gently on the grass, and whispered, "You were right about everything." For the first time in many months, I felt as though she was smiling beside me. As I stood to leave, my phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed Daniel's name. When I answered, his voice was quiet but steady. "Dad, I have something I need to ask you. Not about the company, about whether I can ever become your son again." The question stayed with me all night. Can I ever become your son again? Those words were not about money, power, or Hayes Industrial. They came from a broken man who had finally understood what he had thrown away. The following afternoon, I agreed to meet Daniel at the small lakeside park where I had taught him to fish when he was a little boy. He arrived early, wearing simple clothes instead of an expensive business suit. There were no lawyers, no reporters, and no board members, just a father and his son. For several minutes, we watched the water in silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Dad, I know I cannot erase what I did. If I were you, I do not know if I could forgive me either. I do not want the company back. I do not want your money. I only want the chance to spend whatever years we have left being honest with each other." I looked at him carefully. For the first time in a long time, I did not see the ambitious executive who had betrayed me. I saw the frightened little boy who had once reached for my hand whenever he was afraid. I reached into my jacket and removed the house keys he had secretly tried to take from me. Placing them on the bench between us, I said quietly, "These keys no longer represent a house, Daniel. They represent trust. Once it is broken, it cannot simply be handed back." He nodded, tears filling his eyes. "I understand." After a long silence, I picked up the keys and placed them in his hand. "I am not giving you my home," I said. "I am giving you one opportunity to earn your place in this family again. It will take time, honesty, and patience. If you truly want forgiveness, you must prove it with your life, not your words." Daniel broke down in tears and hugged me tighter than he had since he was a child. At that moment, I knew Eleanor would have smiled. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it gave us a chance to build a different future. As we walked toward the parking lot together, my phone rang. It was Arthur. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "William," he said, "the charitable foundation Eleanor created has officially opened its doors today. There is something waiting there that I think both you and Daniel need to see." The moment Daniel and I stepped inside the Eleanor Hayes Foundation, I felt as though my wife was welcoming us home. The walls were covered with photographs of employees, families whose lives had been changed by scholarships, medical assistance, and emergency support funded through the foundation she had quietly built years before her passing. Children laughed in the hallway while parents embraced volunteers with tears of gratitude. Arthur smiled and handed me a framed letter Eleanor had written for the foundation's opening day. "If you are reading this," she wrote, "then our family has survived its darkest storm. Remember, wealth can build companies, but only love can build a legacy. The greatest inheritance we will ever leave behind is not a house, a business, or a bank account. It is the character we choose when life gives us every reason to choose bitterness instead." Daniel stood silently beside me, unable to hold back his tears. He turned toward the employees gathered in the room and publicly apologized once again for the pain his actions had caused. He promised to spend the coming years volunteering through the foundation and helping families instead of chasing power. No one applauded immediately, but several employees slowly stepped forward to shake his hand. They were not forgetting the past. They were acknowledging his willingness to change. As I looked around the room, I realized Hayes Industrial had survived. My family had begun healing, and Eleanor's kindness was still changing lives even after her death. Driving home that evening, I glanced at the empty passenger seat where Eleanor had once sat beside me for so many years. Instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. She had protected our family one final time, not by leaving us wealth, but by leaving us wisdom. If this story has taught me anything, it is this. The deepest betrayals may break your heart, but they do not have to define the rest of your life. Truth always outlives deception. Forgiveness is stronger than revenge. And the people who truly love you leave behind something far greater than money. They leave behind the courage to begin again. The end.